Okay, it's time to start divulging into the main crux of Vortex for a while. That's right, we're going to be talking about the sprites. And note I'll be saying both sprites and LSW quite a lot in the next few minutes, so bear with that. Now, I know that it is time consuming to get in tune with the style. 4 years on, and I still have so much to learn. But fear not, that's the purpose of this episode. The content that I'm going to be covering should put you in good stead, especially for novices. So, what I like to do is break the concept of producing characters into 3 basic steps: recognition, replication, and improvement. Members who've produced content for us for some time may have performed the first step already via trial and error, but I'll still overview the main things that you should know from it. As the name suggests, recognition is recognizing and analyzing what makes LSW LSW. In a nutshell, what makes the LSW sprite let you immediately know that it's LSW, and not hyperdimension or jump ultimate stars? Number 1. The height. LSW is meant to portray shorter renditions of characters. One reason for this is because they are made for the Game Boy Color and consequently had graphics limitations, but it also comes down to number 2. The proportions. This is different from recognizing the height because the proportions weren't due to a limitation. Compare how big Goku's head is in both sprites in relation to his body and to his legs. There's obviously a massive difference, and this is because it's slightly on the edge of the Japanese super deformed drawing style, which in turn voluntarily illustrates its characters disproportionately. Number 3. A lack of detail. This was probably more obvious than the first one. Goku has very flat and limited colors in LSW, as well as a dark outline. Little too can be seen on his attire, whereas in Hyperdimension, you can see just how many folds his gi has, the amount of solid definition in his muscles, and consequently, we have a greater amount of dimension. The height restriction and the proportions are largely what cause this, since the smaller sprite simply wouldn't fit in what could be on a larger one. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible, as I will later explain. Finally, we have number 4, which are the standard body parts. Depending on what variant you're aiming to later replicate, or perhaps create for yourself, this point could prove to be the most imperative. You wouldn't notice this just from scanning one LSW sprite, but when you compare it to multiple others, you notice that certain parts of the body are either drawn exactly the same or quite similarly. The face shape, the basic eye sets, the ears, certain body positions, all of these echo of a particular stock to which the style was meant to pertain, almost conservatively. Thus, if you keep these stocks in mind, you'll stay in line with the style. Simple. So, from this we can learn that an LSW sprite generally should be quite short. It can be forgiven for having anatomical inaccuracies, and therefore doesn't need to have incredible detail. However, to make a flag point that what you've produced is indeed an LSW sprite, you need to have certain body parts remaining fairly close to their original design. Now, contrary to what I said earlier in the description, I am going to be teaching a bit of 100% custom. There isn't any point in telling people off for attempting it without actually showing how it could be done. So, I'll show you how to construct a basic LSW standing pose. The frames that you're about to see are included in clear PNG format in the description, so it's best to open up those and mimic them as you draw, because it would take too long for me to describe them all in detail. Also, all of the functions that I'm talking about here are from Microsoft Paint. First of all, we recognize both the height and the proportions by drawing in the lines with the line tool for where the main structure of the anatomy would be. So in layman's terms, draw a line for where your character's chin is, the base of their abdomen, and their feet. Use a color that won't be on the final sprite, and use an LSW model for reference. Secondly, we begin to draw in the head with the pencil tool after setting the primary color to black. Mimic the base of the head here as much as possible, because it's generally the same for most LSW characters. Then, we start to draw in the body. For this, we must get a wireframe created, so pick a different color from your proportion lines, and use the line tool to draw in where the legs, the upper body, and the arms will be. Notice that the arms don't go straight down, they're angled slightly, and because this isn't a straight-on view, one leg is angled deeper away than the other. Also, the shoulders are spaced quite widely apart. Remember that, because if your character has muscles, you need the space in which to draw them. More muscles equals more space. The final point is that its left leg ends 1 pixel above the other one, to give a feeling of depth. This isn't always the case, but you should generally try to do so to make the sprite have more realism, although I use that word quite loosely. Now, it's at this stage that I should probably mention that I already have experience drawing standing poses, so I'm comfortable with doing so and don't normally need references. But, if you're just starting out, head over to Google Images and search for poses of Dragon Ball characters to see how you want to anchor your character to the ground. There's no set way of doing so, so perhaps you can craft a distinctive way of doing such, and be remembered for it. Next we flesh out our wireframe. Now the general rule of thumb is that the thickness of the character's legs and arms are between 2 pixels and 4 pixels long. 4 is for either chunky or muscular characters, and 2 to 3 is for your skinny to average Joe model. Try to fall within these boundaries, because any more than it and the sprite looks either unnecessarily bulky or too disproportionate. However, if you're spriting a monster like Broly, that might be the effect that you're going for. Since this is basic LSW that I'm telling you how to do, I'm not going to talk about muscle arm definition yet. That's for another time when I probably go into LSWI at length or something. So when fleshing out the frame, ensure that you keep the boundaries set. As for the hands, look again to other LSW models and mimic those shapes, because as I said, standard body parts echo of the style. So when in doubt, use them, but don't forget to credit the appropriate people when doing this. With regards to the chest, again, look to an old LSW model for reference. In this case, I looked at the Vegeta Saiyan Armor model and did something similar to it here, although I adjusted it in relation to his body position and to the fact that it's actually his chest and not a piece of armor. From here on, you insert your usual face consisting of a mouth and whatever eye of your choice, and then you continue to edit it wherever certain parts feel slightly off. For instance, I moved the right arm inward by a pixel, slightly edited his left arm, and broadened his legs so that his stance wasn't so stiff, and that's a problem that plagues many LSW standing poses, both old and new, so be very careful. That last step of refining what you've done is the most critical to actually applying your skills, because it irons out the imperfections that many people will spot from the get-go. You obviously won't be able to spot all of them, but hey, that's what criticism in the Vortex community is for, and ultimately, that is what the final stage of producing any sprite requires. And so here we are with a naked, finished, and fairly undetailed LSW outline. Isn't he a pretty sight? Homoerotic undertones aside, the conclusion is that you should recognize that what I've described in this episode is not doctrinal by any means. They're merely guidelines, rules of thumb if you will. Any one of these observations or methods can be changed or disobeyed, manipulated for your own gain, in order to seek leverage over what will be the final stage in spriting, improvement. In fact, that's what's advanced LSW so much in the last 4 years. If it wasn't for Sun Goharoto, the characters would still have limited palettes. If it wasn't for members changing the outline color, the outline would still be grey. If it wasn't for large-scale projects, where black shading was removed and extra tones introduced, the level of detail that you could pack into a character today wouldn't be nearly as expansive. So, don't take these notes for granted. They'll help you as the underlay for what you need to understand in making sure that you produce attractive sprites that don't only push the boundaries, but still retain their faithfulness to their roots. Thank you for listening. If you have any comments to make, please head over to the link provided and give me a shout out. The next piece should be coming very soon, and it will be focusing on expanding from the man that we've produced today, so be prepared for some critical two-tone shading advice, understanding the importance of color, and some presentational pointers. Look out for it, and I hope that you've enjoyed this episode of Spriting on a Whim. This has been a DBZ Vortex podcast. Our community is based at www.dbzvortex.tk or forum.dbzvortex.tk. Head over there for a core Dragon Ball Z fanbase, fun people to talk to, and most of all, top-notch LSW sprites that nowhere else on the net has.